And we have a large crowd joining us today virtually, which is wonderful. In terms of this session, reaching mass audiences through technology and media communications, we have heard through so many of the opening keynotes and in the opening ceremonies, from Minister Murray to the Governor General of Canada to Larissa yesterday, and Christina and Sylvia Earle. There's been several reoccurring comments, but one we're hearing over and over is the need like that to build public support, that groundswell of public understanding, connection to the ocean, and just that awareness raising piece. And then also to change the way we think, the way we act, the way we behave. And this session is all about that. How do we take a lot of the practices and the work that's being done and reach those mass audiences to build those emotional connections and to really transform the way we think and do? And ideally, we want this session to be, we brought in four very, very dynamic experts coming from different backgrounds who are using different approaches and have different insights into how to do this. And we're hoping that we get a glimpse into what's working. And for them, what are the kind of questions that they're asking? And so that's what we're here to explore. The format is for the first 30 minutes maximum. So you can hold these folks accountable, that they've got only like 5 or 6 minutes each, and there's 4 of them, to really share kind of a spark talk of the best of what they're doing and the things that they're thinking about. And then we're going to turn it over to a lively Q&A where we want to hear how you guys are thinking about these talks and these questions, as well as the folks online. How's that sound? Awesome. Well, let's get rolling. So first up here, right here in the room, I've got Natalie Hart with me, and from Communications Inc. in the UK. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Diz. So hi, everyone. My name's Natalie. I work for Communications Inc. On my slide up there, you can see I've started off by putting my 3 different titles, my 3 different hats that I wear. And the reason that I've put all 3 on is because those 3 things are key to the way that I think about mass and mainstream communication. So in reverse order, I'm an author, and I'm an author because I really do think that storytelling is one of the most powerful ways of affecting change. I'm a strategic communications advisor because I think communications can affect change at the pace and scale we need for some of the world's most complex problems. And at the top there, I am head of research for Communications Inc. And that's because I do think that communications is an art, but it's also a science. And that means we need to root it in evidence and research, and really measure it and make sure we're doing it properly. So I'm going to go through very quickly 3 key questions. And the first one that I always want to come back to in these talks is just the so what question, like really, why are we doing this? Yeah, sure, it's great to have stories in newspapers. Maybe your press person gets a bit of a buzz, but what does it mean in terms of actually affecting change? And I think that's the impact point, is the point that we need to keep on coming back to when we talk about communications. So with all of the campaigns we do, we talk about creating a social mandate for ocean action. So showing the expressed desire of the people for decision makers and policy makers to act. What we've seen in the climate movement in recent years is that's going well. And in the UK, one of the really interesting indicators of success is that now all of the main political parties campaign on some kind of environmental messaging. They have different ways of doing it, but everyone messages on it because they know it will get votes. And so I would love to see a UK in which every political party was campaigning on an ocean issue when it comes to an election. And in terms of mainstream communication, it's really, we kind of talk about the drumbeat of it, creating surround sound so that it's a top of mind issue in a world where there are lots of different things vying for people's attention. So what do we know at the moment about effective ocean communication? The first thing that always disappoints people is there is no silver bullet. There is no one way of telling the ocean story that resonates with everyone. And it's very frustrating, but that is the way it goes. And so I'd like to share my own story just to illustrate this. So before I came to Comms Inc., I spent 10 years working in strategic communication for peace building and counterterrorism. And I actually had a specific focus on using communications to prevent radicalization. I'd always loved the sea. I loved a sea swim and a dolphin as much as the next person. I didn't build a career in it. But the story that really changed the way I behaved was when I started seeing ocean health and planetary health as something that was a security concern, something that would lead to conflict and cause human suffering. And that was, for me, the story that changed me. And subsequently, colleagues from my old world have also moved across to the ocean because I told that story to them and it appealed to the values that they held. The second thing that we know is working at the moment is authentic, diverse, and representative stories. So I recently worked on a project called Ocean Visuals, because one issue that we'd recognized in mass communication was imagery tended to be nice beaches, sparkly fish. It wasn't doing much. And so we developed a photographic brief that we put out worldwide. We had photographs submitted from over 120 countries. Those people were remunerated adequately. And from that, we created a bank of authentic representative images that everyone could use. And then finally, how do we know it's working? I hope we're going to come on to that in the conversation later. But just to give a bit of insight on the way we work, we talk about measures of performance and measures of effect. So a measure of performance with a story, for example, in the media could be how people are responding to it, comments, if you get to test messaging beforehand, that kind of thing. It's also a lot of the quantitative data of engagement of likes, retweets, so you know people are engaging with it. Measures of effect, causality is much more difficult, and that's where I really hope we can develop shared databases that show how we're changing the needle, how the dial is moving. And that's why, as a communicator that works on policy campaigns, a resource like an ocean literacy survey that's nationally representative is it's gold dust. I was so excited when I saw it, and I really hope that that's something that we can build at a global level. That was a very brief run through, but thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Nat. And be sure to jot down some questions, because that short talk, there's already lots percolating. All right, we're going to move over to Dr. Geraldine Foville, who is going to be joining us, but with a pre-recorded video. She's based in Sweden at the University of Gothenburg.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Diz, and let me also thank you and all the organizer of this Ocean Literacy Dialogue for giving me a chance to join you today from afar and through this video. Today, I would like to share with you a brand new approach to framing ocean messages. It's called underwater virtual reality. I would also like to inform you about two new projects some of you might want to be involved in. One about digital technologies and ocean literacy, and the other one about extended reality and marine education. So let's start with our collaboration on this new technology called underwater virtual reality, or underwater VR. This project is a collaboration between several researchers from the University of Gothenburg and Stanford University. We know that first-hand experience with the ocean is essential for developing ocean literacy, but this is extremely challenging because of its remote nature. And this is where virtual reality, or VR, comes in. It can offer experiences that are otherwise difficult, impossible, or expensive to have. In this study, we are investigating underwater VR, which makes you experience a virtual dive while being physically submerged in water, wearing a waterproof VR headset, a snorkel, and a flotation belt. And this video simulation may seem a bit artificial from where you are watching it right now, but it produces a shockingly powerful immersive experience when in the water. We invited 19 experts in marine science and in education to experience underwater VR in a pool. We then conducted in-depth, semi-structured interview with each of them. Our approach was twofold. First, we wanted to unpack the emotional and physical aspect of experiencing underwater VR for the first time. Second, we wanted to get experts' opinions about the potential and challenges of underwater VR for marine education and ocean literacy. And here is a sneak peek of our findings. First, in terms of how participants experience underwater VR, they reported feeling very physically immersed and reported not just watching the dive in the headset, but feeling it with all their senses due to the aquatic immersion. And as a consequence, to this high level of immersion, they describe experiencing strong emotional reactions, including awe, wonder, as well as relaxation, empathy, and emotional attachments. Moreover, only one participant reported slight motion sickness, although this issue tends to be very frequent in regular VR experience. Second, concerning the use of underwater VR for marine education and ocean literacy, the participants saw a lot of potential for it. And for example, they suggested using underwater VR to let the public experience the same marine environment in a pristine versus human polluted state. The participants were also asked to rate to what extent they thought underwater VR would contribute to the 6 dimensions of ocean literacy, namely knowledge, communication, behavior, attitude, awareness, and ocean connectedness. According to them, attitude and awareness would benefit the most from underwater VR, while communication and knowledge would benefit the least from it. To summarize, underwater VR seems to have a wide range of potential pro-environmental and educational application as it triggers strong emotions toward the marine environment. We are really looking forward to publishing these results and conducting more studies on this new frontier of immersive technology for ocean literacy. Now, I would like to mention that Dr. Rika Woolsey, co-founder of the Hydrus, Dr. Daniel Pimentel, assistant professor at the University of Oregon, and myself are currently launching a new initiative called IREEF, which stands for Immersive Realities for Environmental Education Facilitation. And IREEF aims to advance knowledge on the use of immersive technologies for marine science, communication, and education. And this initiative is getting off the ground with 2 projects. First, Erika, Danny, and I are co-editing a special issue in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. This special issue will publish research papers focusing on the use of technologies to affect ocean literacy. So we are inviting proposals with varied methodology that provide insights into the use and effects of digital technology for advancing dimensions of ocean literacy. Our second project, which is funded by the Unity Charitable Fund of the Tides Foundation, will focus on extended reality, or XR, that includes AR, augmented reality, and VR, virtual reality, for marine education. We believe that in order to study the impact of XR on marine education, we need to base our research on sound XR content. And in this way, the first step is to identify the XR content for marine education that is currently publicly available. Afterwards, we will create an assessment tool that would be used to analyze the available content and shed light on the strengths and weaknesses of XR for marine education. We will also create a network of stakeholders in the field of XR for marine education, from developers to teachers. So if you are in any shape or form involved in a project using XR for marine education, we'd love to get in touch with you. With that, let me wish you a wonderful rest of the conference, and feel free to connect with me via email or on Twitter to keep this conversation going. Thanks again for letting me join this session.
Great. Thanks so much, Geraldine. It was great to have you a part of this conversation. And although it's 1 a.m. in Sweden, if there are any questions specific to Geraldine's presentation, we'll be sure to facilitate that exchange post-session. Now, over to Laura Trethway, who is joining us this evening from Hamilton, Ontario. Writer, ocean journalist, author of the book Imperiled Ocean. Laura, great to have you. I'll turn it over to you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you so much to the Canadian Ocean Literacy Council for having me, and to Diz, who's been a great supporter of my work. I really wish I was there in Vancouver with you all right now. I'm getting a lot of FOMO watching it on Twitter. So next slide, please. So I like to call myself an ocean journalist because the ocean is really the omnipresent background in everything I've written over the last 10 years or so. And this is a look at some of my work here. As a journalist, my primary tool for reaching people is storytelling. And I've noticed that when I tell someone that I'm an ocean journalist, there's an assumption that I write about whales and plastic pollution. And I do a lot of that kind of writing. I used to do that writing a lot when I worked as a writer and editor at the Vancouver Aquarium. But more recently in my freelance career, I've been trying to expand what I find is really a pigeonholing of the ocean by covering, less well-known ocean topics like the deep sea or technology or geopolitics. Because I really believe if we expand the types of stories told about the ocean, we might draw in a different type of person who's not typically reading these more ocean-focused, the more typical ocean stories that you see out there. So with that said, next slide, please. So there's a few statistics that you hear again and again when you write about the ocean, and one of them is at the top of this screen, that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do the bottom of the ocean. I've heard this quote so many times, and nobody ever really explains what it means when you hear it. And so my new book, The Deepest Map, which is coming out this July, it digs into this phrase a little bit more. And when you do that, you discover that it's really about mapping the seafloor, that we've mapped the entire surface of the moon, but only about 23% of the ocean floor with a sonar right above it. And the reason that it's taken so long to map the whole ocean is that the ocean is really big and it's really deep, and it resists the more typical ways of mapping the sea or mapping different planets like lasers. But there's an initiative called Seabed 2030 that is trying to map the entire seafloor by the end of the decade. And that's the initiative that I follow in my book. Here's one of the maps produced by one of the mappers. Oh, sorry, next slide. This is one of the maps produced by Seabed 2030. And this map really puts into context what we have mapped and what we haven't. So all of the black stuff is uncharted seafloor that's never been mapped by sonar. And the colored bits are what we have mapped so far. So coastlines and shipping routes mainly. And so obviously this leaves a lot of work to do. And there's a big question over whether Seabed 2030 can actually finish this in time. Next slide, please. So for my book, I went all over the world trying to find out whether we're going to finish this map or not. And also what we're going to do with that map when we're done with it. And that took me to the Saildrone headquarters in Alameda, California, which is building an autonomous ocean mapping drone, which is really like the future of ocean mapping. And I also went to the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica, where the governments of the world are debating rules for mining the seafloor, which could be another future for the seafloor maps we're making right now. Just a side note on that, unfortunately, a Canadian company called the Metals Company, which is based out of PC, is leading the charge on that. But I'm happy to see that there's been a few Defend the Deep people out at Impact 5. One of my favorite stories to report in the book is about diving in Florida, where underwater, oh, sorry, next slide. I'm bad at that. So here's a few stats that I turned up while I was reporting this story in Florida, which is about diving the seafloor. In the Gulf of Mexico, underwater archaeologists are using seafloor maps to find early human history buried there. So one of these stats that about 9% of the seafloor today was once land, that just blew my mind. And I've never heard that stat before in all my time reporting on the ocean. And about the way that works is that after the last ice age, melting glaciers released water back into the ocean and it drowned coastal areas that are roughly equal to the size of South America. And because we know that humans like to live by the water, today about half the world's population lives within 100 miles of the ocean. We know that these drowned landscapes are definitely where early humans lived and worked and had their whole lives. And it turns out that Florida is really a hotbed for this kind of pre-contact underwater archaeology. Next slide, please. So here's a couple of early hobby divers in Florida who are pulling up mastodon teeth from a river in Florida on the left. And on the right, there's an early diver holding up a paleo point, which is used by pre-contact indigenous groups in Florida. Next slide, please. Most of the time, this kind of underwater archaeology has sort of been ignored in favor of shipwrecks and buried treasure when it comes to the maritime archaeology world. But there is a group of passionate underwater archaeologists who are diving these sites in the Southeast. And so this is the group that I went diving with when I was reporting my book. Next slide, please. And the way that they're finding artifacts in the seafloor is with seabed mapping, a type of mapping technique called sub-bottom profiling. So sub-bottom profilers have been around for a long time. Typically, they're used in the oil and gas industry or to build infrastructure. And what they do is they send an acoustic pulse down into the seafloor that penetrates through the ground and creates this sort of profile snapshot you see on the right, where you see the different sediment layers. Underwater archaeologists knew about this kind of technique, but they weren't finding much when they used it. More recently, though, a research group in Denmark tried this technique at a known underwater site, and they found that the artifacts were coming up in sub-bottom profiling, but they were coming up in sort of a wavering haystack shape that you see on the right, sort of in the water column above where the artifact is. Next slide, please. So the archaeologists I went diving with in the Gulf of Mexico, they mapped parts of the Appalachee Bay with this technique, and they found 18 sites in just a few days. And then we spent 3 days diving them to see if we could find any artifacts. Next slide. And so this is one of the archaeologists who's diving. We're about 2 miles offshore here, but it's still only about 10 feet deep. So you can really see how flat Florida is here, and that the seafloor used to be land about 3,000 years ago. Next slide. And I'm happy to report that every single site we dove, we confirmed as having these human-altered stone debris left over from making stone tools thousands of years ago. So you can see here, this is a sharp edge of the tool, and that's been made by human hands. And these types of artifacts create a very specific acoustic response in the sub-bottom profiler's pulse, which creates that haystack shape in the water column. And what I found so compelling about this story is that ocean mapping is showing the seafloor as not just a natural human habitat or resource, but that there's human history down there, and it's just been obscured by the water. And I find this kind of underwater history can be incredibly educational because early Floridians who lived by the shoreline had to retreat when the seas rose. And today, Florida is facing a similar challenge again when present day residents are going to have to retreat again from sea level rise, this time from climate change. So it's really a story about showing how history is repeating itself. And yes, so just to summarize, my storytelling approach is to engage audience by finding stories that reveal a sort of hidden side of the ocean. I try to center the human or the human impact in my stories. And my work often tries for just a very basic principle of illustrating just how big the ocean is and how little we know about it. Okay, great. So that's my presentation. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Laura. Great to learn about your latest book and the work you're doing, and there'll be some questions coming soon. Let's turn it over to you, Sonia. Last but not least, this is Sonia Lee, a filmmaker, producer, based right here in Vancouver, BC. Delighted to have you. Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you so much for having me, Diz. Good afternoon, everybody in the room. Hello, those in the online sphere. My name is Sonia Lee. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a science communicator and a producer and director of Ocean Stories. And my primary medium is visual media. And so I work in the broadcast and TV space. I work in the digital media space. And I've also worked in ocean science education media. And also I work with scientists to communicate their research. Next slide, please. So I want to focus on audience for my little 7 minutes and why it's important to be very intentional about defining and choosing and understanding an intended audience to have the most impactful communication and storytelling strategy. Next slide, please. So the title of the session is called Reaching Mass Audiences, and I just wanted to point out why that term might be unhelpful. So, in my line of work, you often hear, if you try to reach everybody, you actually reach nobody. And I really believe in that. And the more you define an audience, the more specifically you can connect with people on a deeper level. They feel seen, and the more memorable their experience of engaging with this media will be, and perhaps more meaningful change. The second important thing I want to point out is when you define your audience as the mass audience or general public, I want you to really think about who most people might think that general public is. So it's probably not people who look like me or other historically marginalized communities. So when you're defining your audience as general, who are you including and who are you unintentionally excluding from your audience? And then I just want to, on a positive note, that the media space that we work in right now is actually super conducive to niche audiences. And I hate that term niche audience. It's a broadcast and TV term. It essentially means that an audience that has a definitive, interest or special interest that you can point out. And the way that we consume media right now is very conducive to this. Think about TikTok, think about YouTube, think about, even Netflix. All of these platforms specifically target special interest, and they're doing super well. Like, some YouTubers have millions of followers and they report on a specific topic. So even if you reach niche audiences and specific groups of people, you're still reaching a lot of people. So narrow down your audience. Next slide, please. So I want you to think about the last piece of ocean media you consumed, and I want you to think about, where did you find it? How did you hear about it? Who did you talk about it with? And where did you consume this ocean media? And then you'll notice that it probably came from your ocean friends or the social media account that you follow about oceans or environment or nature. And so we're really, really speaking to the echo chamber. And I feel like as science communicators, as ocean literacy practitioners, we're really trying to reach the people outside of the people who are already interested in the ocean. So how do we do this? Next slide, please. So impact producers and impact storytellers use a strategy where they start with audience, and usually audiences outside of the echo chamber. So they start with, what is the goal? What is the intended goal for this piece of media? And then thinking about, who is the audience or community or people who have the most amount of impact in achieving this goal. And then they tailor their entire storytelling and their entire media strategy to specifically target the people who have the most amount of change, whatever, cash, coin, I don't know. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the building blocks of impact storytelling and impact producing. You start with audience, and then you really think about, okay, where do these people hang out? What platform do they use? And then you get into the storytelling meat. So what characters, what stories, what's the setting, what design elements, what's the style to tailor towards your audience and your platform. And then you come up with a call to action and then measurable outcomes. Next slide, please. Ooh, we missed a slide. That's okay. So Diz asked me to share an example of this that might go to protected areas or policy changes. And this is an example that was shared with me by Vanessa Sorrell, who's the executive producer of Impact Storytelling at the National Geographic Society. And so this is about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And so around like 2020, 2021, there was a big bill that was about to pass on protecting Florida's wild spaces. And so the goal was to get this Florida Wildlife Corridor Act passed. So the audience that this impact group chose were policymakers, both Republican and Democrat policymakers. And the platform was private screenings to these policymakers. And then so the creative pieces that they chose, because these were policymakers, Republican policymakers, you didn't want to put your, normal, very obvious conservation folks as characters. You're not going to speak to that audience. So what they did was you chose constituents of these Republican policymakers. So loggers, ranchers, sport fishing tourism guides, and also scientists. And like, look at this dude here. This is like the most stereotypical like Republican dude you could ever see. And this was a character in a conservation film. And that's because this group of people said this is the best way to reach to this audience. And so the call to action was to pass this act, and the measurable outcome was that the act was passed in 2021 with an additional $400 million of funding. And so the way that if you tailor your messaging, your audience, and all of that, you can achieve policy outcomes in protected areas. And hopefully next time I can show an ocean example. Next slide, please. And so to authentically connect with your audiences, please make sure you have people of that community on your team to really know how to connect to that audience. And next slide, please. These are some resources for impact production. If you want to go into impact producing, next slide, please. And I would really challenge you as science communicators, as ocean literacy professionals, to really reach outside of the box of your audience and your storytelling to reach outside of the echo chamber. I love talking about this. Please reach out to me at any time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shania. That was fantastic. And 4 great stories, perspectives, lived experiences shared. So thanks again to all 4 of you for sharing your stories with us. I'd like to start with asking a first question, and then I'm going to be lurking out to any of you to offer some questions. And Meg will keep an eye on the virtual participants. We've already got 3. All right. You in the room, the virtual folks are out doing you already. So get ready. In terms of my question, I heard things like measurable outcome, meaningful change, moving the needle, or Sonia challenging reaching mass audiences. What do we mean? What does success look like? Like these, we all probably have a different understanding of what each of those means, but where are we collectively trying to land? Like, how do we know we've had a story that's had an impact? I mean, you guys have each given some tangible examples within the sphere of your work, collectively as a community. Yeah, just what does moving the needle look like? Or those kind of metrics to really show causality? I mean, it's an open question, but love to just hear a little bit more when you're thinking about meaningful change or measurable outcome. Anyone want to start?
Thank you. So I mentioned the ocean literacy study as for us a really useful resource in understanding how the needle has moved. And I know one of the things that I found really exciting is the expanding dimensions of ocean literacy and what that means. So not just understanding and knowledge, but also connection to ocean issues. For me, one of the pieces that's missing at the moment is the ability to evidence theories of change. So that's for me, with the policy work we do, a bit of a question mark. So we work on the hypothesis that if people are more aware of ocean issues, feel more emotionally connected to the issues, then when a specific policy campaign comes up, they'll be more likely to support it. At the moment, and I will stand corrected on this, a lot of the measurements that we have that look at levels of support list options, you know, like, do you support MPAs? Do you recycle their plastic? And to me, that can be a bit of a like, would you kill the puppy question? Like, you hope everyone will say no. And so I would like to see, as part of understanding how we move the dial, testing of more real world examples where you have audience who've been essentially primed, who are ocean literate and who aren't, and then are given more complex, nuanced messaging in a way they might experience it in the real world, where there are trade-offs and you know, a conservation decision isn't just yes or no, and then to test the theory of change that way.
This is a very good question. How do you measure impact or change? I think about this all the time, and I've come to, you make up your own metrics because it makes you feel better. Okay, but really, when you have a very, very large goal, you break it down into smaller and smaller steps, right? And so that's how I feel about ocean literacy, or just ocean storytelling in general. So you're not going to get people to care about the ocean if they have zero interest in it the first time. So what is the first step in getting this person who's very not ocean minded to be like somewhat curious or somewhat interested? And I would measure that as a success. So for example, like, there are impact producers who are trying to use the gaming community, who watch people just like freaking play games. And so using that audience and like using some sort of ocean game to get people to just game, but actually kind of learn about ocean at the same time. And so I would measure that as a success. If you have a Twitch audience that's like, I don't know, a very large number who's adjacently talking about oceans, if you measure that as success, then that's success in moving the needle. So make it up, make your own metrics.
Hope there's not too many scientists in the room. No, that's no, I love it. That's great. And it's true. I think the idea of the spectrum, right? It's a spectrum of engagement, and it's a spectrum of success markers along the way. So I think it's a nice way of framing it. Laura, do you have something you'd like to add?
Well, I really agreed with what Sonia was saying. I thought that, yeah, you know, it's hard to measure the impacts of the stories that you put out. I was recently encouraged to see that some ocean stories were actually having impacts on the market valuation of the deep sea mining company that I mentioned previously, the metals company. So recently, some stories that were shared by some brave scientists on board a deep sea mining vessel in the middle of the Pacific. They actually put out some videos of some operations on board the ship that had gone awry, and mining sediment was just being released into the water. And this video was shared around by Greenpeace and a bunch of other organizations. And I think that same day there was a hit on the valuation of that deep sea mining metals company. So, I mean, I see that as like an immediate impact. If we can see a story that, you know, the same day is having an impact on a company's valuation, like, I mean, that's huge for me. So right there, I would say that, you know, as long as we get those stories out there, they do have an impact. They do have a real world impact.
Great. Thanks so much there, Laura. So let's open it up to the room. Any questions? We have a mic here if anyone wants to come forward. It's also a small enough room that if you're just comfortable from where you're sitting and you'd like to ask a question, that would work well too. Maybe just share name and where you're joining us from, what organization.
Hi, I'm Craig Outer. I'm an impact producer and filmmaker from Southeast United States. Something that I noticed in each of your presentations that I'd love to hear a little bit more about is it seems like we're emerging from a period where the dominant element of storytelling was something that was either deeply cynical or deeply fear-based. And we're emerging into a time that hopefully puts more agency in the hands of our audience and of our subjects, and is hopefully creating hope along with that. What ways are each of you working to make sure that we're not creating an apathetic audience and creating an audience that has solutions that they need to create meaningful change?
Fantastic question. Thank you. And it's a perfect connection from our session yesterday. One of our speakers, Alan Kelsey, was talking a lot about the hopefulness, right, in that fostering of agency. And so I love it. Anyone want to take the first response?
I'm just going to talk for a while you think of something good to say. No, it is a very good question, and I think it's important, and also it's a real friction that we come across with our work in terms of getting media coverage in the first place, especially when working with hard news, because often what news editors are looking for in terms of clickbait, in terms of what makes people go and read an article, is completely at odds in terms of the actual impact and effect that we want to have. You know, it's very sad, but hopeful articles don't get as much attention, and lots of news corporations are trying to make money and trying to get readers. In terms of the work that I do at Comms Inc., a lot of our work is with clients and organizations who are working on specific campaigns. And in that sense, we're quite lucky because all of our campaigns are designed around calls to action and solutions. And so for us, the fact that something can be done is the foundation for the campaign. And so that's one way that we address it. In the other work we do, so for example, addressing a communications problem like the imaging, the way we design that is the people's action is the response to the problem. So we saw that there was an image problem, and we got people, thank you, to engage with their own stories. And naturally, we found that those stories were the hopeful stories. A lot of the images that were submitted were images of people engaging in solutions rather than people going to the ocean and seeing anything awful there. And so that's how I deal with it in my work. Sonia?
That's a very good question, and it's something that I think about all the time. But the way that I think I'm kind of cheating in the way that I'm practicing ocean storytelling right now is because I've kind of shifted away from kind of the unhopeful stories or like what is actually happening to our ocean, to really focusing on human ocean connections and really talking about ocean culture, and what kind of reshifting the focus of my ocean science communication and ocean storytelling to why people care. What is the ocean human connection? It's not an ocean story, it's a human story. And it's an experiment. I'll let you know how it goes. But I'm really including, diasporic communities, immigrant communities, people of color communities, stories that we often don't hear in ocean stories. And hopefully when people feel represented in the ocean and connect to the ocean in a different way, or show that people of color can also belong in the space and we can all do something about it, maybe, I don't know, it will be better. I'll let you know how it goes.
Thanks to you both. Laura, did you want to add something? And certainly having read your first book, The Imperiled Ocean, which was chapters all about people's relationship and those human connections with the ocean, of which almost all of them had a positive, hopeful spin. Is there something you'd like to share?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just want to echo what Natalie and Sonia said. But I also think that we're in this age where we're moving from maybe more like doom and gloom stories that often put the onus on sort of the individual to do something about it. I think, maybe just a couple of years ago, the solution to these doom and gloom stories was often like, buy a metal straw or do these actions that will kind of put the individual responsibility on the consumer. I think that we're kind of moving away from that sort of framing. And I don't know if we necessarily have an alternative solution to give to people when you hear stories about, fish stocks collapsing or plastic pollution spinning out in the middle of the ocean. But I think I would also echo Natalie and Sonia's points about just centering the human and the human connection in ocean stories, because I think that you first need to give people a reason to care about the ocean. And if you kind of start with the doom and gloom and then move into these tips for how to save the ocean that don't actually kind of address really huge problems that are going on out there, I feel like we're losing people, and that first we need to establish this ocean human connection.
Great. Thanks so much there, Laura. Another question from the floor. Should we go to Meg? Okay.
I can also read it out. So this one's from Martina from Italy. How do you deal with mistrusted stakeholders? Are there any specific communication techniques to better interact?
How do you deal with mistrusted stakeholders? And any specific communication techniques to address this?
I'm wondering if that means, are we talking about people who've potentially given disinformation in the past? And
I think it could also just be interpreted as there is a lot of misinformation. There is a lot of, or a lack of trust or questioning as to, what is truth out there or sources of information. So in the time era of that feeling, is there any techniques that you guys think about to address that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I take accuracy really seriously in my work. There's a lot of just misinformation and facts going on around the ocean. Just you see them repeated constantly online. For instance, like we can't seem to get the depth of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point in the ocean, reported accurately. There's always a million different numbers floating out there around from, seemingly reputable sources. There's often just statistics that you hear about the ocean that are repeated again and again that aren't, that, have problems with them, or scientists have dug into them a little bit more and figured out that they're actually maybe not the most trustworthy statistics. So I feel like, there just needs to be at a certain level a lot in my work. I try and bring a lot of fact checking and integrity to making sure that all the facts that are in there are accurate, and just doing the old-fashioned work of just like making sure that you're checking your facts, so that if it's maybe a stat that's not up to snuff, or it's just coming from a biased source, that you're running through all those fact-checking processes. So that's really what I do in my own work.
Sure. And there's no pressure for all of you to answer each question.
I think I just want to answer because I feel like my work is very different to Laura's, in that I'm not the face of the communication. And so what I do is a lot about thinking how to communicate. And I think it's, as part of the communications and ocean literacy community, we do need to be thinking about the concept of trust and the concept of different messengers, and how do we equip messengers within our society that might have more influence than we do. And my personal interest, I have a real interest in the role of literature in shaping attitudes and behaviors. And so I ran a panel at the end of last year at a local book festival, and I worked with authors, and they weren't necessarily authors that were writing a conservation story, but their books talked about the ocean and had a conservation impact. There's an incredible book that's come out this year by a writer called Sabrina Imbler, and they've written a book called My Life in Sea Creatures, and it's an exploration of gender and sexual identity that has incredible ocean content in it, and will probably move the dial on ocean attitudes and behaviors in a way that an NGO campaign might not be able to do. And so I think just in terms of trust, we always need to be aware we might not be the most trusted people in the NGO, in the room. The NGO might not be, the scientist might not be, because we know that trust levels in scientists have changed around the pandemic. The policymaker might not be. So who is, and how do we equip them with the information that they need in order to then create a change?
Great, thanks. Nicely put. Sam, come on up.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. And I want to build on that misinformation and mistrust question, because you were talking about the mass audience aspect of the title, but I want to talk about technologies and the recent emerging technologies. And in this era of mass churned content creation and internally scrolling Twitter or TikTok feeds and bite-sized clips and shortened attention spans, what are your perspectives on using these tools? And what do you think the next reality for this science communication and ocean literacy is going to be over the next little bit? What are your perspectives? And, what do you think about being able to use those tools? Is it a fighting uphill battle, or is this something that we can utilize?
That's a very good question. So how do you, in the world of social media and just strolling very bite-sized pieces, I recently talked with a lot of digital media content makers. So digital media being a lot of social media influencers, TikTok, YouTubers, Instagram folks. And they're actually using the trends of like endless scrolling, very fast media, actually utilizing those techniques in their science communication. I didn't know this. I'm not a digital content creator, so I didn't know this, but they purposely speak very quickly. So, and because it stops people from scrolling, and because you like throw content at them, it makes you be like, whoa, what was that? I got to go back and rewatch it. And so they're really like gaming the algorithm and the trends and the way that people are consuming media to actually do their science communication, to get them to actually stop and listen. So people are being smart. Sci-commers are smart using the techniques.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much there, Sonia. Let's take another one from online.
Okay, this one's from Carlos. So first says, many thanks for this very interesting session. Is it possible to share some experiences of reaching preschool or early childhood audiences through this technology with ocean literacy principles and concepts?
Laura?
Yeah, my face probably says it all. Hey, I'm just like, oh. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Reaching preschool and early childhood audiences through technology. Oof. I mean, I tend to be more on the sort of immersive side of actually getting your hands dirty and being out in the environment and engaging with it in a non-technology setting. So So I think that I'm maybe not the best person to answer that question. I'm sorry.
No worries.
I would also recommend that there's great partners in programs and science centers, programs and science centers as experts in early childhood audiences and really speaking and moving science messages towards those audiences, developing resources for parents, et cetera.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kate. And certainly, just as Kate did there, taking the lead, there's so many experts right here in the room. So any of these questions being thrown out by the community can be answered by anyone here in the community. So don't hesitate. Thanks, Kate. Question here.
Oh, I just wanted to also add, there's a lot of really well-meaning science communication materials out there, especially for young kids. And they learn differently at different age groups. And there's a lot of pedagogy talking about speaking to different people. So if you speak to an education professor to reach those kids, that's a different audience. The peak of imagination is in about kindergarten because they haven't learned yet that things can't be real. And so you can tap into that. At certain ages, it's the hero's journey. That's so you can get them to make like superhero cards about an ocean animal or something like that. And so it's kind of the same principles as knowing your audience. It's just that this audience, you're going to have to talk to a pedagogy expert or a teacher, etc., as to what works. And it's probably not worksheets.
I actually wanted to throw a question out to the other panelists, if I could. It's something that, and to the room in general. It's something that I've been thinking about for a while. You see, because I'm a writer, I think a lot about words and how we phrase a connection to the ocean. And something that comes up again and again, I think it's kind of going out of style now, is that you see people say things like our ocean, our planet. And I'm wondering what the other panelists and what the room thought of that phrasing. You hear it also at national parks. When you go into a park, you'll hear like, welcome to your national park. And there's sort of an emphasis on possessing the park or our ocean, possessing the ocean. And I'm wondering what people think of that. Is that, does that create conservation? Does that make you feel like you're in charge of it and responsible for it? Or does it sort of feed into these outdated sort of colonialist perspectives of like man dominating the natural landscape? I sort of wanted to throw that out there to people and see what everybody thought of that.
Thanks so much, Laura. Great question. And even I can just comment on observation in some of the planning of Impact 5, like even amongst the organizing different entities, there was an ongoing debates around that, like our coastline, our oceans, and some organizations refusing to kind of have the possessive language, but it's an ongoing tension point for sure. But I would love to hear if anyone in the audience has a comment on that.
I think it has a lot to do with whether or not we see ourselves as part of the world or apart from it. Because as soon as we begin to adopt a mindset that's more familiar with what we're hearing from our Indigenous partners here this weekend, I think their form of belonging, their form of ownership, is one that is based in reciprocity. But the concerns about colonialism and the concerns about ownership for use, the old form of conservation, which is conservation for use, as opposed for conservation for protection or regeneration, is where we could run into those issues. And I would guess that knowing our audience, knowing who we're talking to and whether or not they see themselves in this nature-human separate spaces or nature-human same system kind of mindset would be where we could either create opportunity or problems with that.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Any other final comments? All right. I'm going to, I want to throw it. We are closing. We're about 2 minutes away, but you want to do one more?
We have one more from Australia.
Oh, well, let's take it
Some
down
from
under. Let's bring them in.
All right. This is from Kristen. Is there any measured research about the impact of communication through art?
That is a question. So, to my knowledge, the research that is available is very much on a case-by-case basis when it comes to art. And so often when artists are given grants, so that there are grants available for artists to work with scientists, they do have to, as part of that, explain how they will measure their impact. I'm not aware of any broad studies on it, but then I also don't know how you would measure it in the broadest sense of the word. So I think it's very much on a case-by-case basis.
All right. This conversation hopefully will continue and throughout the days and to come and beyond this conference. For me, the one question I wanted to pose, and it's not to be answered now, but just to throw out, just as an ocean literacy community or those who either identify squarely within that or just interested in coming in to learn more, is curious around if we as an ocean literacy community have a branding issue, right? We're 25 years into doing work and there's still a lot of misunderstanding and misconception around what the term ocean literacy means. You know, who is our audience? What are our objectives? What are we trying to achieve? So, you know, I think it's really helpful just to learn from this panel of experts as well as the discussion here just around, who are we reaching? What stories are being told? Why? And to what end goal? And what does success and impact look like? So I think all of those insights shared today are really helpful for us as a community to think about around as we evolve, not only just the term and what it means, but the work that we're doing both through practice and research. So on behalf of everyone here and those online, thank you so much to the four of you for your insights shared. And thank you to all of you for joining us. And Meg, if you could actually the slides are down, but there's some postcards around. There is another session happening right after in about 25 minutes here, ocean perceptions and actually what you were referencing, the gold in terms, there are 3 countries who have done that ocean perception research to create a baseline at the start of the decade to get a pulse check of the society around values, attitudes. So that's the next session. And then we've got 4 more throughout the coming days. So would love you to join in. But thanks everyone so much and have a great rest of the week. Take care.
Thank you.